The morning sunlight spilled quietly across the small living room, warming the curtains and spreading a soft glow over the wooden floor, but even the gentle light could not touch the heaviness sitting inside my chest as I held the thin white envelope my son had sent me. It felt impossibly light in my hand, yet it carried a weight that pressed against my heart like a truth I didn't want to face. Mother's Day, the one day I allowed myself to hope for his voice, his presence, even a brief moment of recognition, and instead all I received was 2 crisp bills folded with mechanical precision, slipped into an envelope without a note, without a greeting, without even a memory attached to it. Just money. Cold, silent, emotionless money. I sat by the window, the same window where I had watched him play in the yard as a boy, where I used to wave at him when he left for school, where I waited on nights he came home late from part-time jobs. Now I sat there again, older, slower, with hands that had once carried him through fevers and storms, fingers that had braided his hair when he cried, palms that had wiped away tears he no longer remembered shedding. And those same hands trembled as I held the envelope, because in that moment I realized money was not a gift. Money was a reminder that somewhere along the road he had taken to success, he had misplaced the part of himself that once loved me. I whispered his name under my breath, not in anger, not in bitterness, but in the quiet ache of a mother who knows she has become an afterthought in the life she helped build. He had become everything I prayed he would be: strong, wealthy, admired, feared, powerful. He rose higher than any of his childhood dreams had ever dared to reach, but the higher he climbed, the further away he drifted from me, until now I was nothing more than a faint shadow on the edge of his world, a shadow he didn't even turn to look at. I pressed the envelope against my chest and let out a long breath, the kind that carries years of unspoken stories, memories, sacrifices, and unreturned love. Outside the window, the world moved on with its usual rhythm. Cars humming, birds calling, children laughing. But my world felt painfully still, frozen between pride and heartbreak. I didn't need his money. I needed the sound of his voice. I needed the warmth of his presence. I needed to know I still existed somewhere inside that grown man who once clung to my hand and told me I was his whole world. But maybe success teaches people to measure everything in numbers instead of feelings. Maybe he thinks money can fill the spaces where love used to live. And maybe I'm foolish for hoping that one day he will walk through my door, not as the businessman the world applauds, but as the boy who once promised he would never leave me alone. Yet still, even with that foolish hope, I sat there quietly watching the empty road, waiting for a knock I knew would not come. Not today. Not on Mother's Day. Not anymore. As the afternoon crept in, the light outside shifted from soft gold to a muted gray, as if the sky itself understood the heaviness pressing against my chest. I moved away from the window and sat on the edge of the old sofa, the springs groaning beneath my weight the same way my heart seemed to groan beneath the truth I didn't want to accept. I placed the envelope on the small table beside me, trying not to look at it, but its presence felt louder than any sound in the room. It sat there like a quiet accusation, whispering all the things I had tried to ignore for years, that my son no longer needed me, that success had carved him into someone the world admired but I no longer recognized, that perhaps I had raised him to survive the world at the cost of forgetting where he came from. I closed my eyes and let my head fall back, breathing slowly, trying to steady the ache that pulsed behind my ribs. Memories rose uninvited, soft at first, then sharper. His small hand gripping my shirt as we crossed the street, the way he hid his face in my apron when strangers tried to talk to him, the nights he whispered, "Mama, don't leave," even though I never once did. How could the same child grow into a man who didn't remember the warmth of those moments? How does love fade so quietly that you don't notice it's gone, until you're sitting alone with an envelope full of money that feels more like a receipt than affection? I stood up and walked slowly to the kitchen, my feet dragging slightly, each step echoing in the quiet house. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, counting seconds that felt like they belonged to someone else. I boiled water for tea, though I wasn't thirsty. The routine simply gave my hands something to do, something to hold besides regret. When the kettle whistled, its high, sharp cry pierced through the silence, as if even it was tired of waiting. I poured the tea, sat down at the table, and wrapped my fingers around the warm cup. The heat seeped into my palms, grounding me for a moment. But warmth is a strange thing. When it comes from a cup instead of the arms of someone you love, it feels borrowed, temporary. My heart longed not for tea, not for comfort, but for the presence of my son, for a simple visit, a simple moment, even a simple phone call that said, "Mama, I remember you." But instead, all I had was this house that echoed with memories and silence, and a day meant for mothers that only magnified the emptiness left behind. I wondered then if I had asked too much of life or too little of him. I wondered if love, the kind that keeps you awake at night with worry and pride, eventually becomes invisible to the very person you poured it into. As the tea cooled in my hands, a quiet truth settled inside me. Maybe it wasn't that he forgot. Maybe it was that he thought I would always wait, always forgive, always remain in the same place he left me. And perhaps that was my mistake, loving him so completely that he believed my heart had no limits. But even the strongest hearts have quiet breaking points. And on this Mother's Day, mine felt closer than ever to cracking under the weight of what he no longer saw. As the hours slipped quietly into evening, a soft breeze pushed through the half-open window, carrying with it the smell of distant rain and the faint laughter of children playing somewhere down the street, a sound that once filled my world with purpose but now passed through me like a memory too delicate to touch. I stood by the counter, staring at the old wooden cabinets and chipped mugs, remnants of a life built piece by piece through struggle and stubborn hope, and I wondered how a home filled with so many sacrifices could feel so hollow now. I traced my fingers along the edge of the table where my son once sat, swinging his little legs and telling me stories he made up with his wild imagination, stories that always ended with him promising he would grow up to take care of me. I could almost hear his childish voice echoing in the room, overlapping with the man he had become, confident, polished, unreachable. The contrast carved a deeper ache inside me. How does time transform such tender promises into silence? I walked into the living room, my steps slow, my breath heavy, and sank into the faded armchair he once climbed into during thunderstorms when lightning scared him. His fear back then was simple, innocent, something I could ease with my arms around him in a whispered, "Mama is here." But now it seemed he feared vulnerability itself, feared the reminder that he once needed someone, that his strength wasn't always his own. I rubbed my hands together, feeling the stiffness in my fingers, the fine cracks on my knuckles, the quiet story of decades written on my skin. Stories he no longer cared to read. Maybe that was the cruelest truth of all. Not that he forgot me, but that he outgrew the version of me he once loved. The room dimmed as the sun dipped lower, turning the sky into streaks of muted orange and blue, and for a moment the fading light painted the walls with memories. Him taking his first steps, him laughing when he lost his first tooth, him hugging me tightly on his first day of college as if promising distance would never change anything. But distance changes everything. Distance has a way of rewriting hearts silently. I found myself standing again, restless, pacing slowly as though searching for something I had misplaced. Hope? Maybe, or meaning. I paused near the old bookshelf and picked up a framed photograph of him at 13. His smile bright, his arm around my shoulders as if he owned the entire world but needed me beside him to hold it steady. I pressed my thumb over the glass, brushing away a thin layer of dust, realizing how long it had been since he last visited, since he last sat in this house, since I last heard his voice without it being filtered through formality and hurry. I clutched the frame tighter, and for a fleeting moment anger rose inside me. Not wild, not destructive, just a small spark against the numbness, born from the realization that I had given everything and asked for nothing, yet even that nothing had become too much for him to give. The anger faded as quickly as it came, replaced by a deep, aching loneliness that settled like a shadow across my heart. It wasn't the kind of loneliness that comes from being alone, it was the kind that comes from being forgotten by the very person you built your world around. I placed the photograph back carefully, almost tenderly, and whispered into the quiet room, as if the walls themselves could understand. If he could see me now, would he recognize me at all? And in that moment, as the last bit of daylight slipped away, I realized that the hardest part of motherhood wasn't the sacrifices. It was surviving the aftermath when the child you raised no longer remembers the sound of your heartbeat. As night slowly unfolded across the neighborhood, the streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long, wavering shadows through my window, turning the walls into quiet witnesses of my solitude. I made my way to the bedroom, each step heavy, as though the weight of unspoken years clung to my feet, refusing to let me move freely. I sat on the edge of the bed, running my hand across the worn blanket I had stitched when my son was still young enough to ask me for bedtime stories. Stories where mothers were heroes, protectors, and unbreakable forces of love. Now, I wondered if he even remembered those nights or the way he used to curl beside me, resting his head on my arm until sleep carried him away. I sighed deeply as I laid back, staring at the ceiling where faint cracks branched out like quiet reminders that even the strongest structures carry their scars silently. Maybe that was what motherhood truly was: strength that cracked in private, but never collapsed in front of the child who depended on it. I could feel the emptiness of the house seep into me, not as a chill but as a dull ache that spread slowly through my chest. I closed my eyes, hoping rest might soften the pain, but instead memories came in waves. His first day of school, when he held my hand so tight I felt his fear tremble through him. The nights I stayed awake sewing his torn uniforms because we couldn't afford new ones. The mornings I walked miles to take him to school, whispering encouragement even when exhaustion gnawed at my bones. Each memory felt like a stitch that once held my heart together, now unraveling one thread at a time. I swallowed hard as the ache deepened. How strange it is that the same child who once believed his world ended without me now lived a life where I barely existed. I turned onto my side, curling slightly as if trying to shield myself from a pain that had no physical shape, a pain that came from loving someone more than they remembered to love you back. Outside, a stray dog barked in the distance, a lonely sound that echoed the emptiness inside me. I reached for the small lamp on the nightstand and switched it on, bathing the room in a soft, warm glow that made the silence feel even louder. My eyes drifted to the framed photograph of my son at his college graduation. The pride I had felt that day had been overwhelming, swelling in my chest like sunlight, filling me with the certainty that everything I had endured had been worth it. But now, as I looked at the same smile captured in glossy paper, I felt an ache so sharp I had to look away. Pride and heartbreak had become intertwined inside me, inseparable strands of a story I never imagined would turn into this. I sat up again, unable to stay still, running my fingers through my graying hair, feeling the years that had passed without apology. A question whispered inside my mind, one I had avoided for far too long. Had I loved him so fiercely that he forgot I was human? That I too had limits, needs, and a heart that could break? I wrapped my shawl around my shoulders and stood, pacing the room softly, feeling the old wooden floor creak beneath my feet. The sound seemed to echo my thoughts, worn, tired, yet still carrying me somehow. I paused by the window once more, looking at the empty street, and whispered a truth I had never allowed myself to say out loud. I missed the boy he was, more than the man he became. And in the stillness that followed, I felt something shift inside me, subtle but real. A quiet acceptance that maybe the version of him I mourned was gone forever, and mourning was the only way left to honor the love I once knew. The night deepened, stretching across the sky like an old blanket patched with tired stars, and I found myself unable to stay inside any longer. The house felt too small, too crowded with memories that clung to me like shadows I couldn't shake off. So I stepped outside into the cool air, pulling my shawl tightly around my shoulders as the quiet street welcomed me with its soft, distant noises. The pavement was cold beneath my feet through my thin slippers, but even that discomfort felt grounding, a reminder that I was still here, still breathing, still capable of moving forward even when my heart felt too heavy to carry. I walked slowly down the dimly lit road, passing houses that glowed gently from within, families laughing, mothers being celebrated, children clinging to the women who gave them life. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine what the night might have looked like if things had been different. If my son had walked through my door with flowers or even a simple smile. If he had remembered the love that once held his world together. But the more I tried to picture it, the more painful it became, like touching a bruise that never really healed. I kept walking until I reached a small park at the corner of the street, a place I used to take him when he was little, where he learned to swing without my help, where he scraped his knee and cried into my arms, where he once told me he wanted to become a man who made me proud. I stood by the empty swings now, the chains clinking softly in the breeze, and I felt a deep ache clawing at my chest as memories wrapped around me like ghosts. I sat on a bench nearby, its surface cold and rough beneath me, and stared up at the sky, wondering how a child's love could evaporate so silently that even a mother couldn't pinpoint the moment it disappeared. Was it when he moved out? Was it when success rewrote his priorities? Or had it begun long before, slipping through the cracks each time he grew taller and I grew older? I took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs, and felt tears gather at the corner of my eyes. Not the loud, dramatic kind, but quiet tears that fall when your heart aches in a way words cannot explain. I wiped them quickly, glancing around as if hiding my pain from strangers who weren't even there. It struck me then how motherhood shapes you into someone who never allows herself the luxury of breaking, someone who learns to swallow wounds and smile anyway. But tonight, beneath the weight of an empty Mother's Day and a lifetime of unspoken sorrow, I allowed myself to acknowledge what I had spent years denying. I was tired. Tired of waiting for calls that never came. Tired of pretending his success filled the void of his absence. Tired of believing that love alone could keep the bond from breaking. Yet even with all that exhaustion, a quiet resilience flickered within me, a stubborn flame refusing to be extinguished. I wasn't sure whether it was hope or habit, but something inside me whispered that life didn't end just because someone you loved forgot how to love you back. I lifted my head and watched the streetlights shimmer through the leaves, and for the first time in a long time, I wondered what my life might look like if I stopped waiting for him to return and started learning how to return to myself. Maybe there was still a version of me untouched by disappointment, a version who knew how to breathe without expecting anything in return. And as I sat there in the gentle hush of the night, I realized that perhaps the first step toward healing wasn't receiving love from the one who left, but offering a little of it back to myself. By the time I finally rose from the park bench, the night had settled into a deep stillness, the kind that sinks into your bones and makes every sound seem louder than it truly is. I walked slowly back toward my house, the familiar outline growing clearer beneath the streetlights, each shadow reminding me of a different chapter of my life. Nights spent sewing clothes at the kitchen table, mornings waking before sunrise to prepare his lunch, afternoons waiting by the door for him to return from school with stories tumbling out of him faster than he could speak. The closer I came to the house, the more I felt the weight of all the years I had poured into it, into making it feel safe for him, warm for him, alive for him. Yet tonight its walls stood quietly, as if unsure whether they were still meant to shelter a mother, or merely hold the silence left behind by a son who had forgotten his way home. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, greeted not by laughter or footsteps or even the scent of a recently cooked meal, but by an emptiness that echoed softly across the living room. I turned on the small lamp near the couch, its warm glow barely pushing back the shadows, and for a moment I simply stood there, allowing myself to feel everything I had spent years pushing aside. Loneliness, disappointment, exhaustion, and a strange, heavy kind of grief that didn't come from death but from absence too long ignored. I placed my shawl on the arm of the sofa and walked toward the shelf where his childhood belongings still rested. A small wooden airplane he built for a school project, a worn-out storybook he insisted I read to him every night, and a photograph of us at the beach, his tiny hand clutching mine as the waves curled around our feet. I ran my fingers along the objects gently, feeling memories surface like old, fragile petals floating to the top of a forgotten jar. A part of me wanted to box everything up, to remove the reminders that cut me each time I looked at them, but another part, perhaps the stronger one, held on tightly, afraid that letting them go would mean letting go of him entirely. I walked into the kitchen and filled a glass of water, the silence wrapping around me like a heavy shawl. I leaned against the counter, thinking about the years I had spent making myself smaller so he could grow larger, giving up dreams so he could chase his own, breaking myself so he would never have to break. And somewhere along that path, without realizing it, I had lost myself. I had become a woman defined only by motherhood, forgetting that before I belonged to him, I belonged to myself. I returned to the living room and sank into the sofa, pulling the thin blanket over my legs. The house moaned softly as the night wind pressed against the windows, and I found myself breathing slowly, deeply, letting each breath carry out a piece of the heaviness inside me. I closed my eyes, not to sleep but to listen, to the whisper of the night, to the thump of my own heartbeat, to the quiet voice within me that had been silenced for far too long. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine a future that didn't revolve around waiting for my son. A future where I still had value, purpose, and life beyond the borders of disappointment. It felt frightening and freeing at the same time. And as I rested there, wrapped in a thin blanket and the faint glow of a single lamp, I realized something quietly powerful. Maybe a mother's love doesn't disappear when her child forgets her, but it can change, reshape itself, and find new places to rest. Maybe it can finally return to the woman who carried it all along. The next morning arrived quietly, as if the sun itself hesitated to disturb the heaviness that had settled inside the house. Soft rays slipped through the curtains, resting gently on the furniture, warming the empty spaces that once held my son's laughter. I stepped out of bed slowly, feeling the stiffness in my knees, the subtle ache in my back. A reminder that time had continued marching even when my life had felt paused. I wrapped my shawl around myself and walked to the window, watching the world outside wake up. Children rushing to catch the school bus, neighbors watering their plants, a mother holding her toddler's hand as they walked down the street. Life was moving, blossoming, unfolding, and for a moment I wondered when I had stopped doing the same. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the table, the one where I had once helped my son with his homework, where I had placed his birthday cakes, where I had ironed his clothes and stitched the loose buttons he somehow always managed to lose. As the steam rose from the cup, a strange calmness settled over me, gentle but firm, like a hand resting on my shoulder telling me that something had shifted within me overnight. I realized then that the ache of yesterday had not disappeared, but it had softened, loosened its grip, allowing me to breathe without the weight of expectations pressing against my ribs. I took a slow sip, feeling the warmth travel through me, and suddenly the house didn't feel like a prison of memories anymore. It felt like a place waiting to be lived in again. I glanced at the small envelope he had sent, still lying untouched on the table. For the first time I didn't feel hurt when I looked at it. I felt clarity. I picked it up, opened the drawer, and tucked it away, not out of anger but out of understanding. Money would never fill the space his presence once occupied, and I no longer wanted it to. I stood up and began to open the windows, letting fresh air sweep through the rooms, carrying away the stale stillness that had lingered for far too long. Curtains fluttered, dust lifted into sunlight, and the house felt almost alive again. As I moved from room to room, something inside me awakened too. A quiet determination to reclaim the pieces of myself I had abandoned. I found an old notebook and sat down to write, not to him, not to anyone, but to myself. I wrote about the strength it took to raise a child alone, the courage it took to let him go, and the pain it took to realize he might never return the way I hoped. I wrote until my fingers ached, until my heart felt lighter, until the words no longer tasted like hurt but like healing. When I finished, I closed the notebook and held it to my chest, feeling a small, almost forgotten spark inside me. Hope, not the kind tied to someone else's presence, but the kind that grows quietly from within. As the afternoon sun flooded the house, I realized that although my son may have forgotten me, I had begun to remember myself. And maybe that was the beginning of a new chapter, one where love no longer depended on who stayed or who left, but on how gently I learned to hold my own heart. For the first time in a long while, I smiled, not because someone had returned, not because something had changed on the outside, but because something had finally changed within me. And as I stood there in the soft glow of sunlight, I knew that even if he never walked through that door again, I would still find my way, step by step, breath by breath, into a life that belonged not to the mother I had been, but to the woman I was becoming.